Welcome to the FemInEM podcast, where we explore the stories, challenges, and lessons that shape our work and lives as female emergency medicine physicians. In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Andrea Austin and Dr. Jenny Castillo Cato to talk about the issue that affects so many of us, and that's burnout. Now, our job is stressful, to say the least. Emergency medicine takes a toll on all of us. This is partly due to the constant high-stakes decision-making, the frequent interruptions, the impact on our diurnal cycles, how we sleep, the pay gap, and the second shifts that many of us begin when we're off, among other things. While burnout can feel inevitable, honestly, it doesn't have to be. In this episode, Doctors Austin and Castillo share their personal experiences and their advice on how we can avoid burnout. The next 30-ish minutes are full of tips on how to protect your health, your relationships, and your purpose. One of the most salient stories we discussed is how our work as healthcare providers can mirror the experiences of those in other stressful jobs. For example, military helicopter pilots in active war zones. I can't wait to share our deep and personal conversations with all of you. Check it out. Hello, my name is Jailyn Avila with the Second Shift Change podcast. I am joined by my two special guests, Andrea Austin and Jenny Castillo. Now, Andrea, I have known you for probably, this has got to be the fourth year that I've known you, maybe third, maybe fourth year. We work together. We live in the same city and then commute to a different city about an hour away where we currently work. Andrea is the director of simulation of our wonderful simulation lab. She also is a published author, which I'm excited for you to tell us about your book. She also has a podcast and has a lot of things that she does. She's a very multifaceted lady. And Dr. Castillo, I admit this is the first time that we've met. I've seen your name in emails, and we're all involved in FemInEM with different, we'll say, silos. Although silos is not a great word because we all work collaboratively, but we have different projects that we run within FemInEM. And I would love if you guys could walk me through how you became a doctor, how you became involved in FemInEM, and what things you are into right now. What projects are you working on? Jenny, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for having me. So my little background is I went to medical school in Philadelphia now over 25 years ago, which is crazy. I graduated from residency in New York at Jacobi Hospital, and then spent a number of years working throughout the city in New York City, which is where I still live, in the Bronx and in Manhattan. I also worked out in Long Island. So I did a whole number of different places, including community hospitals, academic hospitals, trauma centers. Throughout my career, I've done all that. So how I got into well-being, specifically physician well-being, and my interest in that, it started off when I was actually going out to Long Island for work, and I realized that I was envying the housekeeping staff when I walked into the emergency department. I was like, oh my gosh, if all I had to do was clean floors and clean the toilets, my life would be so much less stressful, less hectic. The weight of patients, their health, their lives, I wouldn't have that on my shoulders. And then I thought, wait, there's something wrong here. I've spent so many years studying and training for this, and this is what I've been wanting to do. Why am I feeling so low about this? So I decided to kind of re-engage myself. I went through a faculty scholars program that taught me how to teach adult learners. And that led me actually to simulation, which is got me from the hospital in Long Island out to Columbia. So that was where I most recently worked in the emergency department, which was at Columbia University Medical Center. And there, when I got there, I realized my colleagues were really roughed up. I mean, they were tired, they were burnt. And so we had a new chair, and I approached her and I said, hey, I really am seeing this. I feel it myself. I don't really have the words. This was many years ago. And I proposed to her to start a well-being program. And she had no money. She had no resources. And she said, that's a great idea. Go ahead, do whatever you want. But I just can't give you anything or even protected time towards it. So I said, well, I think this is really important. And so I started off small. I started off with, just a little committee and doing really basic stuff, like getting coat hangers for us, getting a refrigerator. We didn't even have a refrigerator to put food into for our shifts. So little wins. And then it obviously expanded to much more challenging things like getting a breast pump, and making sure breastfeeding issues are cleared up. Talking about the overnight shifts for pregnant women and miscarriage, and all these much more detailed and difficult conversations that us as emergency medicine physicians have to deal with all the time. So that took me through to COVID, and in COVID we did a lot of work on physician well-being there. Obviously, I worked with Lorna Breen, who we are, as FemInEM, we are affiliated with, associated with, and her suicide was really very difficult, as you can well imagine. Our department was hit tremendously hard with that, and I decided that we needed to change the dynamic, change the discussion on it, because we were basically being encouraged not to talk about it. I mean, granted, it was now out in the universe in terms of the news, and basically the whole world knew about her. And I thought we need to really discuss this. We need to talk about this. So this was the physician suicide also was very much a prominent issue. For me, I personally then kind of hit a wall. I was working all the time as everybody else was working, but I started having dreams where patients were everywhere, on stretchers, and I couldn't help them at all. I just rows and rows of patients, and I would go to work for a 12-hour shift, and after 6 hours, I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't focus, and I didn't know what was happening. And I spoke to my husband, who was in the military, and he was deployed to Iraq for a year, and he knew exactly what I was going through. He hit the nose on the nail on the head, I guess is the saying. But he said, "You're going through PTSD." I said, "No way. There's no way. Absolutely no." And he said, I had this story that he had never told me, which I think was incredibly poignant for emergency medicine or medicine in general, where he was in Iraq. There was a flight that had crashed, and he had to go and recover the bodies of the pilots. There was 2 pilots, and the head of the group that was head of the soldiers that were in that group was with him, and he noticed that there were 2 life jackets that were in the plane, and he asked the company commander. He said, "Well, why didn't the pilots use those jackets to not crash?" And he said, "Well, that's not what we're trained for. We're trained to fix the problem, and then crash. We're not trained to get the life preserver, life vests, life jacket, and jump out and save ourselves." And I was like, "Oh, this really makes sense. This is what medicine's about. This is how we are trained in medicine as well." And at that point, I let my husband convince me to take a break. So now I'm currently working multiple things, kind of like Andrea, but I'm not working in academic center anymore. I'm working in an urgent care center. I actually have my own podcast called Medicine, Motherhood, and Metaphysics with an emergency medicine friend of mine who lives in California. And doing a little physician review, chart review work on the side, and doing obviously FemInEM work and some consulting for well-being, including I just finished up a project with the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, IHI, using the for the workplace change collaborative. So just doing some consulting work with the different things for health provider well-being.
What an amazing story. I think about Lorna Breen and I think about how stressful COVID was and how that was probably the hardest part in my career. And I want to say I'm like in the middle of my career, maybe front half, but maybe middle of the career. I graduated residency in 2015. So I was a full attending when the pandemic hit and I got COVID. And I just remember that feeling. And this is not, to necessarily compare, but just to say like, man, that was really hard to be that sick because it was, it was OG COVID before we had the vaccines and it was like very strong and feeling so horrible and then feeling like I couldn't help these patients who were dying and also feeling like I had put my family in extreme danger by trying to help others. And that was very hard for me to kind of get past and to work through. And I know that in New York, it was very rough. I remember seeing the news stories and talking with my, physician colleagues that worked out there, and it's kind of intense. And then I also want to comment on the fact that sometimes, and I remember there was a word, I think it was like a German word, where you take experience from a completely different field and apply it to another field that hasn't been exposed to that specific thing, and it dramatically helped that field. And for you, it's amazing how this analogy of the life preservers or the life vests of the pilots is an amazing analogy for what we need to do better in medicine. I mean, you can argue that we should do better with that, with everything, but specifically for us in medicine, it is very important to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves because we can't take care of our patients effectively if we are not doing well, and we can't have a life outside of the hospital if we are also not doing well. So thank you for sharing that, and a very crucial and important story to share. And I imagine it's also somewhat difficult to share. So thank you for that.
Yes, you're welcome. And I did notice that a lot of my colleagues, they leave emergency medicine only when their bodies can't do it anymore, and it's because, at least from my experience, I also got COVID, but in 2022, and I got very sick from it, and everybody around me wasn't getting so sick. And I'm thinking, I was out for 6 weeks and I had, vaccines and, I had been exposed for 2 years now. And but I was incredibly ill, and I'm just like, my body was just tired. It was done. It was not happy anymore. And I finally made that choice to walk away, and it was the hardest choice that I ever did, but it was incredibly helpful, and incredibly important for me, not just for my own health, but for the health of my family, the health of my relationships, and I it's just important to know where your body is, to be connected with your body. The mind and the body is very much connected. And I was totally disconnected from my body during that time. And once I realized that my body was really not feeling good, I finally stepped away. So, and it doesn't mean that like my emergency medicine career is over. It wasn't that, though it felt like that. But it's not that way. Now that I'm 2 years out of that, I realize that this was such a good move for me, and has brought up a lot of wonderful experiences that I would never otherwise have had.
Andrea, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I went to medical school at University of Iowa, and the first part of my career was in the military. So I took a health professions scholarship program, HPSP scholarship from the Navy, and that brought me to San Diego, where I did my residency. And then I stayed on as faculty at the Naval Hospital on active duty. I deployed to Iraq in 2016, came home in 2017, and then I did part of my career up at LA General at Navy Trauma Training Center. And I would say I've always kind of like dabbled a little bit in the well-being space. I wrote an article about burnout in Change a Shift around the first year out of residency. You know, I think burnout in residency is really common. And, you know, for me, it was kind of that first year being an attending, finding my niche. And then I had a lot of responsibilities related to being in the military as well. So it was more kind of like a time management problem. And it was interesting as I recovered from that episode of burnout, it was like, okay, I've got this figured out. You know, I know how to work my night shifts. I know how to essentially navigate some of the individual factors related to burnout. So then when burnout, you know, reared its head again, it was a little bit confusing. And the analogy I like to use for burnout is if you think of burnout being like a tree and it's above the surface, the root structure can be really complex, and the root structure can change throughout your career. So it may be, you know, related to sleep deprivation. You know, that's very common during residency. And then another part of my burnout story was gender bias. There are very few women physicians in the military and at the time in my residency program. And I experienced quite a bit of gender bias. And while that was happening, FemInEM had just emerged. And so connecting with the FemInEM community, and really that was my first time connecting with a group of people that understood what I was going through and could provide the language. You know, I didn't realize that I was being gaslit during residency when I would bring up issues that were happening to me that weren't happening to other residents. So FemInEM provided that community, the language, the support, and, you know, again, got me through kind of another layer of that burnout. But as everyone's alluded to, the pandemic was like, you know, this whole nother layer. Layer's not even the word, just like the floor fell out underneath of us. You know, I say a lot of times that emergency medicine is constantly running on the margins. Like we're always kind of teetering of falling off the cliff. And the pandemic, you know, we fell off the cliff. You know, we were rappelling off the side of the metaphorical cliff. And that's where the burnout reached a new layer for me. And I think my story really dovetails well with Jenny's, that as I was recovering from burnout, I realized that it was not just burnout and that there was a significant amount of post-traumatic stress. And I would also encourage people to look up and read about complex post-traumatic stress. And it's my feeling that probably the majority of emergency physicians, after a period of time, 10, 15 years, most of us have a component of complex PTSD. And essentially the short version of that is post-traumatic stress, like after a single trauma, is more associated with a set trigger. Like if you were robbed at gunpoint outside of Dunkin' Donuts, every time you go past the Dunkin' Donuts, you've kind of flashback. Complex PTSD is that you've had a lot of different traumas, a lot of different triggers. And so it's complex, as the name suggests. It's very hard to unwind what is triggering you and how to unpack that. So, you know, we've kind of, you know, my career and experiences, we've hit a potpourri of different topics. And, you know, what's brought me to FemInEM 2.0 is really how do we pick up the gauntlet and make well-being something that's real. I think well-being is something that's thrown around a lot. And FemInEM has always been rooted in authenticity, in community, in the lived experiences of the people in this community. And so for me, taking up this gauntlet of well-being is something very important and sacred, that we have to get this right, that literally our colleagues' lives are depending on this. And despite the numerous organizations that have been doing work in this space, we still have a lot to do. So I'll let you pick up any thread you want, and Jenny and I can share more about what's going on with FemInEM and well-being.
Andrea, that is an amazing story. I know a little bit about your combat experience because we've spoken about it, and you were deployed with one of my cousins as well, and I've heard stories from her. And to me, it's kind of interesting, and I was wondering if you'd comment on that, how I imagine that you had issues, right, with the deployment, but how it was COVID at home that actually kind of triggered these changes, at least the most recent changes. What was the difference from being in an active war zone versus being in COVID with regards to how you were able to cope?
Yeah, I think everyone's experience is so unique. And, I know your cousin very well. And while we were on the same deployment, hers was a couple years later and very different than what I experienced. I think during my deployment, there was kind of this, your nervous system activation, like you get very activated being in a space. So to kind of paint a picture for people, the trauma resuscitation area was in a building, but the ceiling was blown out. There was like rebar coming down. And so it's weird walking into work every day knowing that a bomb has like gone through the roof and nobody's fixed it. And, then the sirens go off and you put on your flak jacket and your Kevlar helmet and you go under a table. And the weird thing, if going back, and I know this probably sounds so stupid to people, I knew I was going to a combat zone. And I had many people that had gone before me that were in my network, but nobody really talked about like the possibility of getting hurt or killed. And so it wasn't until I was actually there that it started to become more real. And then that was hard to, like, you're there and you're trying to process that at the same time. So I would say my deployment, like taking care of trauma patients, for me was not particularly traumatizing. I felt very well prepared to do that, and I had a great team around me, and it was very meaningful work. For me, kind of the trauma of deployment was more just some of the dynamics. One of the things we're learning about well-being is your experience working is very dependent on the leader you're working for. And so if you have poor leadership, the toxicity that creates can be incredibly traumatizing. And I had some great leaders while I was deployed and then some really toxic ones. And honestly, I feel more traumatized from some of those experiences and the dynamics that it created than taking care of, again, the patients that I was trained to do. But yes, when I look back on like the last, 15 years of my career, by far the worst part was during COVID. And I think it was at the very beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know how to protect ourselves. So at least when I was in a combat zone, I had this, reassurance of the flak jacket where, you're going to go to this place when you hear the sirens. But we didn't know. So when I, saw my therapist and we were talking about this, I felt like when I go into a patient room, and they are talking or coughing or yelling, and you could just visualize what the droplets coming out, it felt like, shrapnel coming at us, that we didn't have anything to protect us. And so there was that. And then the moral injury, I think, is what we're all describing too, is this helplessness that we could see the system starting to collapse, and that there weren't enough resources. And then some of the things I talked about in my book that, were really hard during COVID was not just the physical resources. It was the way we were hardening and the way you would see staff respond and not necessarily be the most compassionate in certain circumstances. Like I had a elderly gentleman that we were trying to admit, and he wouldn't wear his oxygen, and then he didn't want to go upstairs because his family couldn't go with, and I found him in the room with his oxygen off, just kind of discarded. And when I went to talk to somebody about like what was happening, they're like, well, he's leaving AMA, it doesn't matter. And just the hardening that happened was traumatizing for me.
Yeah, I mean, we were all working at that time, and I definitely mirror that. One of the things that was difficult for me was when, you'd have a patient that was somehow awake and talking with a SAT of 65% that thought that me putting on oxygen was harmful and didn't want the medications and the treatment, and viewed me antagonistically as if I was creating the problem rather than this pandemic, as if I was doing this as a kind of conspiracy to I don't know, politically motivated, financially motivated, whatever it was, when, obviously that wasn't it. We were just trying to do our jobs that we had trained for and worked for our entire lives to take care of these patients, and then to be disvalidated or unvalidated in what basically our career and what we had worked so hard to do was definitely, it was difficult, to put it mildly.
I also have kind of realized, I completely agree with both of your stories. I have tons of them as well, but I guess I'm noticing that well-being and burnout, specifically burnout, it's not just like one time, like I just thought, okay, I'm going to hit burnout, and I will experience that. It will suck. I would feel awful. I'll climb out from that hole, and then it's going to be done. Not exactly. And I think that's a little surprising, like even though there's going to be, there's medical students and physicians and, new residents who have not gone through medicine during COVID, they're still going to experience it. It's just not going to be because of COVID. I mean, there is definitely still things within emergency medicine and medicine in general that can trigger, like Andrea was saying, it's the constant trauma, things that we see, as an example, I had in residency, I had a 10-year-old who came shot in the head, and she passed away, and it was incredibly traumatic because no one talked about it. Like no one after the case, everybody just went to the next patient. And I was, a second-year resident, and I was like, oh my God, what the heck? I have no idea how to handle this. And it stuck with me for 20 years, like just knowing how, like, why me? Like, why did this happen to me? And why did this happen to her? And, just all those questions. And I really think that all those little traumas that we hold on to, we carry over the years. And after years and years of experiencing these challenging cases, it gets really heavy to carry those. And so though I say, I'm kind of transitioning here on what we can do in terms of emergency medicine and well-being and the institutional or organizational things that can help well-being and provider health, welfare, we still have to acknowledge that we are human, that we do have feelings. We do have to learn how to work within the challenges of emergency medicine, including, and each person's different. I'm not blaming myself for burning out. However, I am a part of that. The way I handled things, the way I understood things, the way I didn't take care of myself, I have to take responsibility for that. And in addition to all the other things a lot of things that the organizations can do to help, and policy, and the government can help in terms of trying to make changes that will make medicine healthier for everybody. I feel like I have to acknowledge that I was a part of my own well-being, and I have to take responsibility for that.
So with all that in mind, and with all that experience that both of you have, what is your project within FemInEM where you're hoping to support a broader network of physicians than you already support?
Yeah, I'll take that to start. The issue with well-being is it is complicated. And as Jenny talked about, there's this individual component, and then there's this organizational. And so Wellness 1.0 was doctors fix yourself, do some yoga, do some meditation and financial planning, and you'll be okay. And Wellness 2.0, the pendulum swung the other way. There's some people that if you mention individual practices to support well-being, they kind of lose it. And they're like, don't even mention that to me. You're gaslighting me. It's all about the institution. It's all about the organization. And it simply can't be that way. If you run a thought experiment, and let's say you develop the most utopian emergency department possible. It is honestly amazing. It's designed perfectly. There's a breastfeeding room. There's, wonderful ergonomically designed workstations, sound dampening. It's amazing. And you have perfect staffing, everything. And then you show up sleep deprived, or you show up and you're sick. Even though you're in this perfect environment, then you're not going to have a great shift, or a great shift as you could. So there's clearly an individual component to well-being. So, one of the things, and many people know I'm a coach, there's this idea of dichotomous thinking, like it's either me or it's the system. Well, no, it's and. We work in a complicated environment. So what we're trying to do with FemInEM is acknowledge the individual component, and also recognize that emergency medicine is very different than other fields. There's some individual stress, there's individual differences in the way we work with the circadian shift disturbances, the volume and complexity that of just even stimuli that we're exposed to in a given shift is different. And so some of the well-being practices we need to do individually are different. And the more I learn about this, I personally think that we should be approaching our well-being more like an Olympic athlete. I know you, and I use the Oura Ring. I think Jenny may as well. And I'm not getting any money from Oura, whatever device you might be interested in using. But the purpose of a device like this is to provide some objective feedback that can help us optimize our well-being. So I learned using this device that it's going to take me about 2 days, sometimes 3, to recover from a single night shift. So that's very helpful information in designing my life. I can now look at my calendar, and if I have a night shift on it, I need to really decompress what's happening afterwards and make sure that it's nothing too physically strenuous or mentally strenuous as well. So that's like one example of some of the information that I want to be providing is how can we optimize our own physiology, knowing that we're going to be going into a very imperfect system, but how can we show up as healthy as possible to sustain the challenges that we're going to enter. And I'll turn it over to Jenny to discuss more of that organizational lens that we're going to be also addressing.
Yes, I completely agree with you, Andrea. All the individual help things. I don't use the ring, but I do use the watch that gives me heart rates and things like that. And I actually noticed when I had when I was really struggling at work, my heart rate would be 110 for 12 hours. And that's not sustainable. So it is definitely helps with giving you feedback as to how your body is being affected. In terms of the organizational well-being, we are trying to gather lots and lots of information. So it could be a one site, one all shopping, one whatever the saying is. I'm not good with sayings. One-stop shopping is what I'm trying to say, I think, to the website, and be able to divvy it up between individual references, individual information, and then organizational information. And that organizational information can be from shift design to policies regarding breastfeeding, policies regarding working overnights, and how as you get older, how it affects your cardiovascular health. Basically just giving either it could be a manager, it could be a department chair who would get this information, it could be a CEO of a hospital system who could be using this information. And we're going to be doing more of the some very good papers, that will give you some really research-based evidence as to what these projects or these programs would work, but also just, quick things you can look and be like, oh, okay, how can I change this one little thing, or where can I get that information? So we're going to try to combine it all into one space, so that it could be, like I said, a one-stop shopping.
So that's going to be for a well-being hub that is not quite live yet, right? But it is in the process. We're recording this in mid-July. And hopefully soon we'll all I have access to it naturally. And it's great as it is now, but that'll be something that I believe will be freely available on the FemInEM.org website.
Yes.
Yes.
Got it.
Yep. Hopefully will be soon. So, and certainly we'll make sure it gets announced widely, where we can't wait for it to go live.
I can't wait. Andrea, you already answered one of my kind of follow-up questions, which I love, which is a tip for optimizing wellness. And I realize that that's broad. It's like saying a tip to be healthy, right? Everybody's needs and everybody's physiology, everybody's schedule is different. And you mentioned making sure that you are prepping basically based off of objective feedback, which I love, to be able to deal with night shifts, which are a big problem for emergency medicine physicians. Jenny, I know that we can't really boil it down to one thing. It's difficult. But if you had one, maybe two tips that might be useful for our listeners, what would you recommend?
I would also recommend treating it as if you are in an Olympic or a professional athlete, because mentally, it's emergency medicine it's like you're going into Super Bowl game, every shift. You have to be 110, 150% mentally there, and physically there. You have to be physically there, because it's a very physical job. We are not sitting at desks. We are intubating. We are doing chest compressions. We are doing, running from patient to patient. So making sure, as the Olympic or professional athlete do, they are eating well. They are making sure that they are getting rest. and sleeping. Have to be on we have to be really, really on in our shifts. So remembering that rest is very important. We're not good at resting. And I just like a Olympic athlete, rest is just as important as strengthening or training, right? We need to remember rest is important for us. I think that's one of the biggest things that I had not taken into account. And I think the other thing that I had not taken into account, family and relationships and how important that is in keeping up with that, even though it's super challenging. Because whenever I go to a shift, it's almost like my family doesn't exist. Like my mind is so there, but it's not. It can't be that way. And then so reminding yourself that yes, you still have a family, you still have a life. There's still something outside of emergency medicine that you have to think about and keep in mind while you're at your shift.
Jenny and Andrea, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share with us your viewpoints, your experience, and some tips even on some actionable things that we can do to help us in our emergency medicine jobs. And even, this is easily something that could apply to any other medical specialty or really any other career. So I very much appreciate that. Andrea and Jenny are just a wealth of knowledge and experience. You both have podcasts. Andrea's podcast is called the Heartline Podcast, and Jenny's podcast is Medicine, Motherhood, and Metaphysics, which I just love that title. It's a brilliant title. Mm-hmm. And Andrea mentioned it at the beginning, but you recently wrote a book that talks about your experiences, and it's been very helpful for me. There it is. It's Revitalized. And thank you so much for sharing a copy with me. And if anybody wants to contact you, what would be a good way? Instagram, Threads, an email? How can people connect with you apart from consuming your content?
Well, thanks, Jailyn. It's been so fun being on the podcast. And I'm most active on Instagram and LinkedIn right now. So that's a good place to find me. And please keep coming to the website, FemInEM.org.
And definitely thank you again for having us. I'm really excited about working with the FemInEM group and getting that content out. And you can also find me, I'm mostly on Instagram and LinkedIn as well.
And we will put all those links in the show notes as well. Dr. Castillo, Dr. Austin, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
As we've heard today, burnout is not just a single moment of exhaustion. It's a cycle that can reappear throughout our careers if we don't actively and continually address it. One of the most powerful stories for me from this conversation with Doctors Andrea Austin and Jenny Castillo was the helicopter pilot analogy. In an emergency, pilots are trained to fix the problem in front of them and focus so intently on the mission that they are taught not to put on their own life preservers, even when their own lives are in danger. As physicians, especially in emergency medicine, we often do the same. We push through that fatigue, we skip meals, and we sideline our own health because we are taught that the patient comes first. But the truth is, if we neglect our own life vests, life preservers, we can't be at our best for anyone else, including our patients, our family, our friends, and ourselves. So what can we do? The strategies we discussed are not abstract. They are immediately actionable. Tip 1, adopt an athlete's mindset, even if you don't consider yourself an athlete. Prioritize nutrition, hydration, and physical conditioning as non-negotiables for performance. Tip number 2, schedule rest and recovery. Protect your time off the same way you protect patient care. Number 3, strengthen your social connections. Make space for relationships that refill your energy outside of medicine. Next, Leverage technology for self-awareness. Use wearable devices to track your recovery, your sleep, your activity, and listen to what that data tells you. We talked about the Oura Ring, but you can use the Whoop Band, you can use a smartwatch, and personally, I like using the Hatch alarm clock to help me wake up in a more gentle manner. And finally, you can advocate for organizational change, push for better staffing, supportive policies, and work environments that acknowledge the physical and emotional toll of our jobs. Patient-centered factors aren't the only things wearing us down. Especially for women in emergency medicine, gender equity adds another layer of stress and isolation that often goes unspoken. In our conversation, we touched on questions that we would love to explore further in the future. How does unequal recognition or advancement affect a physician's sense of purpose and belonging? What extra emotional labor are women in medicine expected to perform, and how does that contribute to burnout? How can institutions actively remove barriers and create systems where women have equitable access to leadership roles, mentorship, and pay? These are not just theoretical questions. They shape our daily experiences, our longevity in the field, and our ability to thrive. If this conversation has resonated with you, I encourage you to take one of these concrete steps this week, whether it's blocking off time to rest, reaching out to a mentor or a peer for connection, or opening an honest discussion at your workplace about equity and support. Burnout is not inevitable, and addressing gender inequity is not optional if we want a sustainable and thriving workforce. Thank you for listening to the FemInEM podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you found value in today's episode, share it with a colleague, leave a review, and join us for future conversations where we explore the human side of medicine and the changes that will shape its future. Until then, remember, your life vest matters. Put it on first.